Good evening and welcome to Transition Talks Tuesdays in partnership with New Lisbon High School, Juneau, Adams County, and the Southern Regional Center for Children and Youth with Special Healthcare Needs. This is part one in our 2022 Fall Spring Transition Talks Tuesdays. And we are so excited to have Barbara Katz for Family Voices of Wisconsin here. And she is going to give us this awesome overview about what's after high school and what we kind of need to know to make this successful. So Barbara, thank you so much for being here tonight. Well, we're having technical, audio issues.
Sorry.
Oh, beautiful, perfect.
Muted. Thanks, Tim. I'm delighted to see all of you and to be back for a Transition Tuesday talk. What's after high school? So the most important thing tonight is that you all have a chance to have your questions answered. And so if we don't get through the whole training, it's okay, because you have it a very similar one on our website. And so it's most important that we answer your questions. This is just a little bit about Family Voices. We're a family-run organization. There are 4 staff. We're all parents of kids or young adults with special health care needs or disabilities. And basically, we pride ourselves on taking complex topics and making them easy to understand for both families and those who support them. We partner with the regional centers, and Tim is the director of the orange section here, and that is the regional center that he was referring to at the beginning of this recording. So why do we care so much about transition, right? It is what everybody does when you leave high school and you go into life. But for kids with disabilities and special health care needs, we have to pay special attention to that. Turning 18 in our country turns an individual status from a minor child into the age of majority. So what does that mean? Basically, that means that an individual is then responsible for all of their own actions and decisions. When someone turns 18, it's the end of parental rights and parental decision-making authority, and that the rights and the decision-making authority then goes to the individual. And our law does not separate out those who have disabilities and those who are typically developing. So we need to be intentional to support those who have disabilities and special health care needs as they're going through transition. But as such, it makes us feel a little bit like this. And we acknowledge that transition is complicated, right? Yes, the family and the youth are in sort of the center, and all of these bubbles of supports and services surround them. So there's a lot that we have to think about. But at the very least, there are some things that we must really pay attention to very specifically. And one is the transition IEP. The transition IEP begins when somebody is 14, the year that they turn 14, and K-12 education that the IEP supports ends the year that somebody turns 21. And so it's within that 7-year period that transition is formally acknowledged as an activity within the IEP, and as such, certain supports and services and related services will be wrapped around the child to support their goals. And this is the opportunity when teenagers start preparing for work or post-secondary education or whatever path they choose to start pursuing when they leave high school. So that's sort of all wrapped up within the IEP. Then beyond that, applying for benefits as an adult, there's different criteria for Medicaid, for Social Security, for other public benefits, for children and for adults. And 18 is that magic age when that switch flips. And we're looking at different criteria and different eligibility rules. Additionally, we're looking at assistance with decision making. And so on the previous slide, we talked about how the decision making authority moves from the parents of a minor child to the individual when they become 18. And so sometimes kids with disabilities and special health care needs need some kind of assistance with that decision making. And we'll be talking tonight about some of those tools that can be used to assist with decision making. So as I said, there are some legal changes at age 18. And there are also some things that need to happen that anybody needs to do. Again, this is regardless of ability or disability. Oftentimes, by the time someone is turning 18, they'll have a driver's license. However, for some kids with disabilities, a lot of kids with disabilities, driving isn't an option. And so they still need to have some kind of identification, a legal form of identification. And the Department of Transportation offers state ID cards for no charge, no test. That is a legally recognized form of ID. And that is something that has the person's address on it and can be used when they register to vote and when they vote. And so voting is something that is talked about a lot within IEP teams. Voting is one of the most straightforward ways that somebody can use their rights as a United States citizen and influence policy. And registering to vote and participating in voting is a very important community activity, again, for all individuals, all adults, including those with disabilities. So those would be some tasks to do. Another task is signing up with selective service. So again, selective service does not care if you have an ability or a disability when it comes to just registering. And so that is something that's often forgotten. But sometimes public benefits, the availability of public benefits can be impacted on whether or not somebody is signed up with selective service. So that's another thing that needs to happen. And so if you're forming a checklist of things, those would be things to add. And then those dates that we already talked about within the special ed within IDEA, beginning transition at age 14, and then knowing that special education in public school ends the year that somebody turns 21. So another sort of date to think about is connecting with the Aging and Disability Resource Center in your county. Now, the ADRCs are in most every county. Some counties share aging and disability resource centers, but they're in pretty much in every county. And what they do is they're a place to offer information. They're a place for you to receive information. They're also a place where you can talk about how to go about applying for public benefits or reapplying for public benefits, depending on your situation as an adult. So for SSI, the rule of thumb, supplemental security income, the rule of thumb is to apply right after the person turns 18. That's because when the person turns 18, income and assets that are reported are only their income and assets, not the family's. And the disability criteria is also different. And so if one applies before somebody turns 18, the wrong eligibility criteria will be applied. It would be child eligibility criteria. And importantly, the family's income and assets will be looked at, not just the individuals. And this is true even if people are living with their family. They can still apply for SSI as an independent adult, having only their income and assets looked at after they turn 18. Medicaid. Medicaid is something that is, it's a path to long-term support services, and it's also a way of providing health insurance. So being eligible for Medicaid provides an amazing amount of healthcare coverage. Again, criteria is different for children and for adults. And so it's important to talk with the ADRC to find out how somebody can either apply or reapply for Medicaid as an adult. And when we talk about long-term supports, we're talking about these things called home and community-based Medicaid waivers. So in the kids' world, it's a children's long-term support, or the CLTS waiver. In the adult world, it's family care, or IRIS. These are long-term support programs that help people work that provide support for people to work in the community. They provide support for people to live in their own homes, and they provide support for people to participate in community activities. As I said earlier, Medicaid, eligibility for Medicaid has to happen for someone to access these long-term support programs. They are Medicaid programs. I'm going to pause now. I just gave you a whole lot of information to see what questions there are. I don't see anything in the chat about questions.
No, I am not seeing anything in the chat either. Anybody want to unmute and ask any questions or any clarifying? And thank you, Julie, for clarifying where your ADRC is. I always get confused whenever I get out of Dane County. So thank you. Okay. All right.
If I can just add something.
Please.
Sure.
I've been working with ADRC out of Juneau County since their existence, and fantastic agency and very helpful. And I've had people from ADRC actually attend IEP meetings or come in and to the school and meet with families. If it isn't an IEP meeting, it might be a one-on-one session, but they are very helpful, especially with SSI and SSDI. So at least with New Lisbon, if there's ever a question, let me know or call ADRC directly.
Great, thanks, Julie. So we've been talking so far tonight about these legal changes that happen at age 18, and that sometimes people with disabilities need assistance with decision-making. They might need assistance with decision-making their entire lives, or they might need assistance with decision-making for a few years. It's totally variable. But this whole sort of umbrella of assistance with decision-making is sometimes called supported decision-making. And there are multiple tools that can be used, and they do run sort of the gamut from least restrictive to most restrictive. So let's talk about some of those tools now. There are tools where the person with the disability sort of remains the decider, right? And so basically that means that they keep their civil right to make their own decisions with assistance. And so some of those tools that can be used with that is a very simple release of information or a consent form. And that's something that is signed typically annually at the schools by parents, so that the school IEP team can have access to different community therapy reports or medical information, things like that. With a release of information, the person who's responsible is signing and saying they're giving permission for their personal information to be shared. Sometimes we'll see this in IEP meetings. If no other assistance with decision-making tools have been implemented, the person who is 18 and or over 18 in the IEP meeting signs the release of information forms, and will even need to sign a release of information form for the school to share information then with their parent. So that's a really important thing to remember. There is a new, fairly new, about 4 years old, legally recognized tool in Wisconsin called supported decision-making agreements. Now, supported decision-making agreements is a tool where the person with the disability can identify and sort of ask people to support them in different aspects of their lives. So someone with a disability might ask, person A to help with decisions around healthcare, person B to help with financial decisions, persons A and B to help with school decisions. Really, the person with the disability determines what areas in their life they want assistance with, to what extent they want assistance with. So, what they're formally asking this person to help them with. Sometimes it's making a decision. Sometimes it's acting as sort of an interpreter or a translator by taking complicated information and making it understandable to the person. Sometimes it's as a communicator. If the person with the disability has a speech impediment and may be hard to understand by people who don't know them, the supporter in the supporting decision-making agreement might act as their voice in different kinds of transactions. And so then the person with the person with the disability then in both of these situations retains the right to make decisions and can change their mind whenever they want, as far as who's going to help them make these decisions. So that's a tool that the Department of Public Instruction, I believe, has come out with a memo talking about how this will be integrated into IEP teams, and how schools and families will be talking about this actually at the IEP teams. I am the mom of almost 31-year-old son who has intellectual and developmental disabilities. And when my son Ben was transitioning, we only heard about guardianship. We never heard about any of these alternatives, and there were no agreements with the department coming from the Department of Public Instruction, no recommendations beyond talk with the family about guardianship. Now there's a whole range. I mean, in this past decade, right, there's now a whole range of choices and options. Yes, it makes it more confusing, but in the long run, it really better supports people with disabilities to retain their sort of their authority and their over themselves. So something to really take seriously and to think about. Now, there are tools for supported decision-making where somebody else is the decider. And the other thing that I want to say before I get there is that these tools can be used together. So there's nothing saying that these tools work in isolation. They often work in conjunction with one another. The representative payee trustee is a mechanism that the Social Security Administration offers, where someone essentially manages the person's Social Security check. And so they receive the check, and then they have the responsibility for paying the expenses that Social Security would cover: food, clothing, and shelter. And so they're essentially handling those financial transactions. There is a mechanism called a power of attorney, and there are several power of attorney types. Power of attorney for the person, which includes healthcare decisions; power of attorney for the estate, which includes financial decisions. When a power of attorney is enacted, it either for a short time or permanently gives decision-making authority over to somebody else. And the power of attorney document will name the sort of the duration and the extent of which to which that person has authority to make decisions for the person with the disability. And then the biggie of someone else being the decider is guardianship. And that is where basically all decision-making authority is taken away from the individual and given to somebody else. So the individual has to go to court, be declared incompetent, and then a guardian is appointed. The guardian then makes choices for what's called their ward, which is the person with the disability. So guardianship's court appointed. It may be temporary, it may be permanent. It's important to know that even within guardianship, Wisconsin law allows people to make choices. And so there are some rights that within the guardianship process may be determined to remain decision-making rights with the individual for whom guardianship is being sought. So for example, earlier we talked about voting. Voting is a very common right that people seek to retain and not give that away, that right to vote. Similarly, getting some licenses is another kind of commonplace where people will keep that right to get a license, to apply for a license on their own behalf and not have to go through the guardian to do that. So I will stop now and see what questions people have around guardianship and supported decision-making options.
Barbara, I do have a question, and this has come up at least with some of my parents. What is the best route to go through if you are looking at starting the guardianship process? Do they just find their own attorney, or do they contact an agency first, or how would this be the best way to go about?
So if someone is thinking about going the route of guardianship, I would ask them to spend time learning about the alternatives before they go there, would be their first step. After they've learned about the alternatives to guardianship and have made the decision that guardianship is still the best way, I would contact their county court and see if they have a packet of information for those who are looking to petition the court for guardianship. Third, I would call Tim and his crew and say, I know you can't make recommendations of professionals, but do you have a list of attorneys who might practice in Adams or Juneau County who do estates and trusts? And that would be a place to start. Then the family would need to either talk with other families and say, hey, if you sought guardianship for your person, who did you work with? And would you recommend them? So talking with other families is a great step. And then sometimes aging and disability resource centers also have lists. They will not make recommendations, but they might have lists of attorneys who practice in the county where where people live, to see if they can provide some starting point. Googling is a great place, you know, our friend Mr. Google, to say trust and attorneys dealing with trusts and estates, special needs trusts and estates, attorneys dealing with guardianship. Those kinds of searches will pay off. Really, the agencies cannot give recommendations of attorneys. Families can give, you know, one-on-one recommendations if they've had experiences, but the regional center and aging and disability resource centers cannot. And so this is where the family grapevine really works well. But I would really, you know, I was very serious at the beginning when I said step one, to make sure that families know what the options are, because this is not saying whether, you know, which type of supported decision-making tool is better than another. But families and youth must be able to make informed decisions, and they must know what their options are. And so, and that's one reason why the Department of Public Instruction came out with this informational memo about looking at alternatives, because many times guardianship is the solution, but many times guardianship is not the solution. And people, because they don't know what the options are and feel like they really, their person needs some kind of assistance with their decision-making, they go to guardianship because they don't know of the options, but that might not be the most appropriate solution for the person. That was a very long-winded answer to your question, Julie, I know. Any other questions?
I guess to Barbara, if there is a social worker involved with the county Department of Human Services, does DHS help at all with getting them started?
Nobody can give, because of liability, nobody gives recommendations.
Okay.
So the county, similarly, county children's long-term support and service coordinators might have names that families that they've worked with have gone, but they will not make a recommendation whether that person is good or not good.
And I wasn't looking for recommendations, just a starting point.
Yeah. Sure. I think families can talk with whoever supports them to see if they would know. But really, I think to start the process is to contact the county court, because some families, a good number of families, feel like they don't need an attorney and can go through, with the court's help, can go through the guardianship process on their own. And as part of the guardianship process too, the court, once it's started, will appoint someone called a guardian ad litem, who acts as sort of an advocate for the person for whom guardianship is being sought. And that guardian ad litem will also work with, make a recommendation to the court as to whether or not they think guardianship is appropriate. So yeah, there are a lot of moving pieces, but not everyone uses an attorney.
I had a quick question. This might actually go more to Julie. Barbara, when you're saying like definitely look at all the options even before guardianship, and there's lots of things to pick from now, or that might be more appropriate. Does that you know, is the IEP team like a good place to kind of start with examining all that stuff?
Absolutely.
Is that part of IEP, like their role in the, my little guy is younger, but in the high school level?
Yes, absolutely. And so sometimes and this is also really dependent on the IEP. So when Ben was going through his transition at high school, and it was actually his IEP team who were saying to my husband and I, when are you guys seeking guardianship? So it was on their agenda to remind us about this. Now, it's not, from my experience, and educators on here, you sure can correct me, but it's through my experience really not part of the IEP team's work, but it most always comes up in discussion and conversation and in planning for to talk about, at least, you know, what are you thinking, what you family, what are you thinking about around supported decision making.
Okay. Thank you.
Julie, do you have experience where the IEP teams would go further than that?
We pretty much, most of my students at my level, and I'm high school, are pretty mild. And years ago, and Barbara was right, years ago, the individuals whose disabilities were severe were the ones that generally had guardianship. And I had some I thought were pretty severe, and they were not. They go through an extensive evaluation, or at least they did then. Now they have things like, okay, you might have a child who can make some good decisions, but would not understand the healthcare field and would need someone who really did understand to make those decisions. And that's where the court can say, okay, you know, you as a parent can take responsibility for that. Or if the child doesn't have good money management skills, and I don't mean just blows their money on Netflix or something like that, but, you know, really does not understand the concepts of money and doesn't understand paying bills and such, there could be a power of attorney or a financial advisor. And I forgot the term that's used, but Barbara did touch on it earlier. So we might start out the conversation, but that's about all the farther we get. It's something that we talk about. Did you think about this? And then perhaps try to steer them in a direction such as you may want to look into the courts. And I think what I will do, Barbara, at least for our county, is find out who they contact in the courthouse. Because, you know, you show up to a courthouse and it's like, now where do you go?
And so it's typically the probate department. So it's the county circuit court and it's the probate department. And so Tim just put in an excerpt from DPI Bulletin 8, which is also excerpted then from the statutes from supported decision-making agreements that about information about how this is included in the IEP. So thanks, Tim. But basically, it says information on supported decision-making should be provided at any time guardianship and alternatives are discussed, including during any and all discussions about transfer of rights at age of majority. And so this is this bulletin talks about students transferring the rights. And again, these are decision-making rights from the parent to the student at age 18. All right. Any other questions about supported decision-making? Okay. I'm going to quickly go through a couple of other pieces. If you sat through the, if you listened to the training online, you'd see that there's now 3 domains that we look at. We look at health, education, and community living. So when we look about in health, these are things to think about, right? How is healthcare going to be paid for as someone is transitioning. And we'll be looking, so things to think about are private insurance and public insurance. Public insurance being Medicaid and Medicare. Private insurance being commercial insurance that somebody would get through an employer or else on the marketplace. One thing that's important to know is that some commercial insurance plans offer this disabled dependent provision so that past the age of 26, if someone is going to have a disability throughout their life, you can contact the parents can contact their insurance company to find out what the rules and procedures are for identifying their adult disabled child under the disabled dependent provision and what that means. And it might very well be that somebody can continue to be covered under their parents' health insurance, private health insurance, after the age of 26, as long as that parent maintains that private health insurance. So that is something to consider if that would be appropriate for children after they reach the age of 26. But the Affordable Care Act says that all people, regardless of ability or disability, can be covered on their parents' plan up to the time that they turn 26. Depending on the person's medical needs, will really be telling you how much attention needs to be paid to their healthcare transition. At the very least, we might be looking at that transition from pediatric to healthcare providers. And then we'll also be thinking about things like supported decision-making. And again, depending on the person's health situation, they might want to look at portable medical information. People who are leaving high school and are more and more in the community, working in the community, doing volunteer work in the community, doing just regular community activities, might find that they want to carry some medical information with them. And so talking with the doctor, the primary care doc, about, are there emergency plans? Are there medical alert bracelets? Is there other kind of technology that we should be thinking about as the people are getting more and more independent in the community? They might have medical situations where they might not have someone who knows them. Well, they might not be able to communicate what kinds of assistance they need. So having some kind of device or paper copy or some kind of portable medical information might be beneficial. And that would be a conversation to have with the child's primary care provider. When we go into the education, we're looking not only at K-12 education, but whether or not the person is going to continue education afterwards. And then also some of the things to think about is, well, when we start talking intentionally about transition within the IEP, this is the time that we start thinking about, well, what sort of path is the person on? Are they on a path to getting a high school diploma, where they need to have all of the credits that are necessary for high school graduation? Or are they going on an alternative path that, if the district offers something like a certificate of completion, is that adequate? And would that allow for more broader and more creative course selection for the person that's more in line with their interests, if they're not going for that high school diploma? So that's something that can be talked about with the IEP team. Whether or not to graduate after the senior year, whether to stay on with an 18 to 21 year transition program, whether to participate in graduation and continue special ed, how that can be accomplished. And it can be accomplished. You just don't get a certificate of completion or a diploma at graduation. And a lot of people are sort of skeptical about continuing school after their senior year. So this is the time that I think one of the most creative times of IEPs is what happens during that 18 to 21-year-old programming, right? Kids can get ready for participating in secondary education. Maybe they'll take a class at a tech school. What kinds of job development opportunities are there? What kinds of volunteer opportunities are there? I remember when Ben was in high school in his transition years, he volunteered at a local nonprofit, and through his volunteer work there, he learned keyboarding skills that he didn't have an opportunity to learn in his classes. And it was from that volunteer opportunity and those keyboarding skills that he learned then gave him the skills that he needed for one of his paid jobs after high school. And so you never know how volunteering can pay off, and it can pay off in many ways. Maybe life skills training is something that a student would want to focus on during part of that 18 to 21-year-old program. And if so, what does that look like? Does that look like being independent in an apartment? Does that look like getting around the community using transportation? Does that look like trying out different jobs or having different kinds of assessments to see what kind of job preferences the person has and where their skills can best be utilized? So there's a lot of richness that can happen in this transition age. What's important to know is that if somebody does continue school after special ed stops in K-12 education, the year that they turn 21 or anytime before that, that IDEA stops into all the protections of IDEA. So colleges and tech schools do have offices of disability services, but they're not guided by by IDEA. They're guided by the Americans for Disabilities Act. And those are different protections, often lesser protections and lesser kinds of related supports and services that are offered through the ADA than was available in special education. A student will need to have a disability determination to get these accommodations. And the accommodations would include like tutors or extended test times or note takers or different technology. What's really sort of like the big aha for students who had been in special education and then went to post-secondary education is that they didn't realize how much the responsibility to seek out these disability services was rested on the student. They didn't realize how, in K-12 education, the IEP team sort of wraps around the student, the child, supports them in a very holistic manner. And oftentimes, supports and services come to the student. Well, the student needs to seek out the supports and services. And for kids with things like executive functioning skills, organizing that and putting those pieces together can be really daunting. So that's something that, in that 18 to 21-year-old program, how can a student, if they're thinking about going to college or tech school, how can a student be prepared to work on those potentially those executive functioning skills, those organizational skills, those self-advocacy skills? And then our last area is community living. And that's sort of like the biggest area that we look at, right? That is basically, what do we want our lives to look like? What do we want to do to have a meaningful day? What do I want to do for fun? Who am I going to live with? And then think about what those supports are. So when people are going, we've been talking a lot about that connection of the IEP with work, because work is something as an outcome that a lot of people with disabilities really feel is important for their meaningful day. And so there's different kinds of work opportunities to think about. There's integrated employment. There is less commonly segregated employment, which are spaces only for people with disabilities. And then there's places for people who might not either be able to work or choose to work, or can work a little bit, and those are day services where someone might go someplace to be connected in their community, to be connected with others, and that contributes to their meaningful day. Just like we talked about how pieces can work together around supported decision-making, so can these employment and day service options can work together. Somebody does not need to sort of identify one of these opportunities on the slide. They can look at, you know, maybe they want to do some mixture of supported employment and day services. Maybe people want to work full-time. Maybe they want to make work part-time, but that's where decisions come in. The other piece is that DVR, the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation through the Department of Workforce Development, is another support and service that comes in to a person's life when they're in high school, typically the last couple of years of their high school, and they support these long-term support programs to pay for those who will help the person live that meaningful day. So they'll pay for people like job developers or job coaches, or those who might, or transportation. DVR does a lot with assessments. They do a lot with looking at work incentives offered through Social Security. And they also have a place in, when Ben was participating with DVR in high school, I had this myth that it was like a one-shot deal, right? That DVR came into our lives once and that was it. That's not true. DVR can work with individuals multiple points in their lives, even well after they transition. So DVR is one of those resources that people want to keep on their in their toolbox of resources that they might want to check out later on. But if a student is in their last year or so of school and you've never heard of DVR, this is the time to bring it up with your IEP team and to make sure that IEP teams have connected people with DVR counselors. Later on, somebody might think about living in their community. Lots of options there. That's one of those transition activities that we'll think about later, right? It doesn't have to happen when somebody turns 18. It doesn't have to happen when someone leaves high school. Some people might choose for that to happen, but it doesn't have sort of like an age expiration date on it, right? This can happen at any point during a person's life and often will happen at multiple points in people's lives. Participating in the community is another important element to think about sort of in an ongoing way. when we think about what makes our lives most meaningful, yeah, it might be work, yeah, it might be school, but often it's what we do for fun, right? It's people we connect with, it's our friends, it's those social connections. Well, the same for people with disabilities. And so for the person and people that support that person to think about contributing to their meaningful day. What does community participation look like? This was a lot, very quickly, right? What's most important is that people think about what is that first thing that is going to happen? What is that first step that people might take? Maybe it will be checking out some of these amazing resources that Tim has put into the chat box and that you will receive in an email after this training. Wisconsin is so rich in resources. Oftentimes it's a matter of how to put the pieces together, how to identify what comes first and sort of that timeline, right? Which is why we started this training talking about, at the very least, think about that IEP team. Think about who you're going to assist with decision-making, and think about that transition of public benefits. Then the other pieces are going to fit together. And there'll be new people in your lives that will help you put those pieces together. So, end of formal comments. Love to have answer any other questions that remain. I know this was a lot. You probably was like, where do I even start to ask the questions?
I would say, Barbara, you did an awesome job covering everything. Very superficially, but that's okay, because in the future, in the next 7 webinars, Tim has arranged it where a lot of things that Barbara covered tonight will be covered more in depth.
Exactly.
So if you're feeling so overwhelmed about this, don't panic. It will be more in depth down the road.
Yeah, plus those resources will be great.
Barbara, I would like to know, do you have contact information that people can reach out to you?
You bet.
Because
I'll put it in the chat box.
You are definitely a support agency, especially for families.
Yes. And
as I said before, you guys provide a wealth of information for a lot of people, and especially like me. I'm not just, but I am an educator, and I've been doing this for a long time, but I have not been a parent of a child with a disability to understand what parents have to go through. So you would be an awesome person to contact, and thank you so much.
Absolutely, please do. And please check out our website. It is, Tim put it up earlier. I'll put it in again, familyvoiceswi.org. We have a ton of really helpful information there, especially our fact sheets. People around the state love our fact sheets.
Absolutely.
And I don't write them, so I can tout how great they are. And they are just, again, it's a way that we take these really complicated, complex topics and make them understandable for families and those who support them.
Awesome. Tim, thanks for putting all of this stuff together. You have put a lot of work into this, and I think it's very worthwhile. I'm very excited to get our parents, and I do know we don't have just parents, we do have some educators here, so I'm really excited to see all of you here, and hope you'll come back in our future webinars. But thanks, everybody.
Yes,
absolutely.
Thank you all so much.
And Barbara, just so you know, so everybody, just so you know, at this point, I would be normally putting in a link to the evaluation, but I seem to have lost it. So you will be receiving an email from me afterwards. Please, I beg of you to fill out the evaluation that will be linked to that once I relocate it. But please do feel free to register for multiple sessions of Transition Talks Tuesdays. Thank you so much for being here, Barbara. I learned something new every time. So thank you so much. Everybody have a great night.
Good to see everyone. Take good care.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.